Could you please talk about the role of the Organization of American States? What have your interactions as a foreign minister with the OAS and with Mr. Almagro, its Secretary General, been?
I mean, Almagro, ever since he was elected on a progressive platform. Not everybody who voted for him was convinced that he was progressive, but anyway, that's an old story. But ever since he turned his coat and became sort of trying to become the best pupil in Donald Trump's class, I mean, really, he's tried to warm to the, to try to really, really be subservient to the Trump administration. But in any event, in the last few years, since he did that U-turn politically, he's been a very nefarious character in Latin America. He's certainly polarized things unnecessarily in a number of countries where there was conflict, when you would expect a Secretary General to be a force for negotiation, for appeasement, for dialogue, for, not someone who throws oil on the fire, which is what Mr. Almagro does systematically. So I think he's been a very nefarious person. I think a lot of people on the left, but also on the right, are very suspicious of him because he's someone that creates more problems than he solves. He's also someone who is, I think, very dangerous in terms of some of the things that he has proposed. He's been one of the key supporters of a violent outcome in Venezuela, a supporter of the US sanctions on Venezuela, but also a supporter of a military option on the table, as the US authorities have sometimes put it. So someone who is not at all someone who tries to play the role, a traditional role of a Secretary General of a multilateral organization, right? The Secretary General is not the president of a region. He is someone who has to be a sort of catalyst of the will of states. He has to be essentially execute the command of the collective will of states and governments, and not override it and be a sort of a lone ranger who does whatever he wants. And so that's created a lot of trouble for him, both on left and on the right, but obviously particularly on the left, because he has an agenda, and that agenda is to get rid of progressive governments in Latin America, particularly now that he's facing his re-election in March. So he's running for re-election as Secretary General. He really wants the support of the Trump administration, so he's trying to show that he's like a super hawk, close to Bolsonaro, which obviously Brazil is another important player in the region, close to Trump. I'm not even sure the State Department likes him that much because he's too much of a maverick. But maybe, people like Senator Rubio and Donald Trump himself, maybe possibly even Mike Pompeo, I don't know. I think his strategy is to try to shine with them by being super aggressive against the left in the region. So we've seen a number of things that he's done recently. One of them, which is unbelievably, really nefarious precedent and totally illegal, was to give the Venezuelan opposition a representation in the OAS. So now today, Venezuela in the OAS is not the Venezuela in the UN. It's not the Maduro government. It's the self-proclaimed Guaido government. It's the only organization in the world where the opposition, the self-proclaimed Guaido, actually is representing Venezuela internationally. Not even after Cuba lost its seat at the OAS in 1962 was the Cuban opposition, or the Cuban government in exile, if you like, in Miami. Not even then did that happen, and did the OAS accept them as the authentic representative of the Cuban state, right? I mean, it's incredible, especially as the OAS should clearly recognize the governments that the UN recognizes, and the UN recognizes the Maduro government. This is not to say there aren't any problems in Venezuela. Clearly there are many, and these needs to be solved. But to do this is a legal precedent that is extremely nefarious and extremely damaging for the organization itself, for the OAS, obviously. And that's an extra vote for him, conveniently. And as you said, the latest Almagro trick has been to support a coup in Bolivia. And he did this by, I think, manipulating an already problematic report from a mission of electoral observers, so an OAS mission of electoral observers, who made a significant mistake, if in the best case scenario, if it wasn't a lie, on 3 occasions in the original press release on the 21st of October, then again in the preliminary report on the elections on the 23rd of October, and then finally in the preliminary audit report on the 10th of November. Anyway, they made a very misleading claim about a change of trend, which then was interpreted by Almagro as fraudulent elections, when there is clearly no evidence so far presented by anybody that the elections were fraudulent. Irregularities you have in all elections, and if you look at any elections, including everywhere in every country in the world, you'll find irregularities. But what we need to find is fraudulent elections with a fraudulent outcome. And that has not yet been proven by anybody, but it was enough for Almagro to declare formally, and I quote, "Yes, there has been a coup in Bolivia, and it was a coup organized by Mr. Morales through fraudulent elections." You can imagine how nefarious that statement is, and of course applauded by the United States. And so now a de facto government that's taken power in Bolivia after the coup is obviously going to vote for him. So that's also convenient. That's another little vote for his re-election. And it's very much the agenda that's guiding Secretary General Almagro right now, who is a very, very problematic figure internationally, causing a lot of polarization in Latin America at a time when there's a new kind of Cold War in Latin America, a very political divide between left and right, between two contending, competing visions on development, one of them neoliberal, the other one post-neoliberal, which has all sorts of repercussions on the developmental model, but also visions on democracy, on human rights, on all sorts of things, right? And instead of trying to mediate that sort of replica of the Cold War that's unfortunately taking place in Latin America, Mr. Almagro has been, I think, exacerbating conflict both within countries, between governments and their opposition, but also between countries, between neighboring states. And I think that's very unfortunate.